Today we're going to get into a painting of the feature of the eye, and while it's certainly going to involve a little bit of conversation about the structure of the eye, it's also going to be very much a painting tutorial. So we're going to just talk about a lot of the solutions that are going to be necessary to make a good painting of an eye, while also touching on some of the topics, like for instance how the light is refracted through the cornea and hits the iris and the effect that that takes. We're going to relate some of that structural, conceptual information to how the painting is actually going to take place as well. So the palette that I've chosen here is really my basic palette that I use for a lot of different projects. And it's kind of a slightly expanded Zorn palette. If you look at the top row of it, we have black, alizarin crimson, vermilion extra, yellow brown, and this is flake white. I've also added cobalt blue to that. So for me, and this sounds really funny, I know, but for me, this is a really extended palette. So this is, I'm kind of branching out from what I would normally use, just using black as a blue as my default. The reason being is that eventually when we're painting the iris and getting into some of the light that's hitting that, I'm gonna need to probably push this a little bit cooler than what I would otherwise, because if we consider the rest of the flesh tones, that this eye here, really 90% of the space that's involved in it can be painted using just black. Even when we get into some of the cooler temperatures just here, medial to the tear duct, even those don't go outside of what ivory black would be capable of in terms of temperature, especially in relationship to an overall kind of warm flesh tone everywhere else. The one that all of you at home may or may not be kind of experiencing though in terms of your palette is the lead white. And it's a very kind of divisive pigment in the sense that I know a lot of people will not like to use it because the taboo of using lead and its kind of dangers. It's like a neurotoxic or a neurotoxin, lead is. Anyway, it's bad, we're sure of that much, but for me, I just found that eventually the transparency and the low tinting strength of lead white was just kind of irreplaceable, and that's why I've kind of gone that route. So if you need some convincing to get over the line, I would say it's worth wearing gloves when you paint and using lead white rather than being a messy painter and using titanium. Because I say that because that was always my argument to not use it was, well, I'm too messy, I get like paint on my hands and things, so how could I use lead white? But eventually its properties, its very particular properties are so useful that I couldn't deny it, which eventually you want to think about with all of your colors, right? What is it adding to your palette? What is it giving you? So when you're painting experientially, is your yellow really helping you, or do you find yourself kind of fighting against how low tinting it is, for instance, if you're using like a yellow ochre? Or is your ivory black, for instance, is it too oily? Every different manufacturer of a color is going to have a different formula for how they produce it. And even then, making oil paint is a pretty organic experience. It's people shoving pigment and oil into a mill, and each time you're probably going to have like a little bit of a different configuration in each run of a color. So you might have some black that is really, really oily or separates in the tube a lot. Maybe you want to think about a different brand or different manufacturer. So anyway, this is just a little bit of background on the palette, my kind of extended Zorn with the addition of this alizarin crimson, and I've also added cobalt blue, which admittedly I didn't actually notify anybody about, so I hope that you have a little bit of blue on hand. If not, going to your ivory black and making sure that you keep the rest of the painting really, really warm will probably do. All right, so starting out the painting, I just want to talk a little bit about the strategy that we're going to use to kind of get to that place. Now, since I have a really well-defined drawing underneath my painting, it enables me to do some things, and I've also sealed that with some polyvinyl acetate glue, which means that I can kind of paint on top of that surface with impunity. I don't have to worry about taking up any of the pigments that are on my paper already. However, if you're starting out just on a fresh canvas, or you're going to make the entire drawing in paint so that you don't have an underdrawing, I think some of the things that I'm going to do strategically in the beginning of the painting will actually still work for you just fine. So depending upon what your approach is, a lot of these concepts I think can still apply. But what I want to do starting out actually is I want to kind of wash in a kind of generalized flesh tone. Now, this generalized flesh tone will be semi-specific to the model that we have. So we have a model with fairly light skin, rosy complexion around the eyes. So I'm going to choose basically kind of a light mid-tone, kind of peachy color. I'm going to wash that over the entire surface. The reason I'm doing that is so that I can get a kind of baseline color and baseline value that's easy to paint into. For those of you who are a little bit more familiar with oil painting, you'll understand that in fact, starting out in oil painting, making that first brush stroke on the canvas is a little bit clumsy until the entire surface is covered with some oil paint, so that you can kind of easily facilitate the addition of other colors and brush strokes and things. And this initial wash of color, really that's what it's meant to do, is just to give me a nice base to kind of paint into. With that in mind, I'm not going to use a lot of oil or medium in order to expedite that spreading. I'm just going to take a nice bristle brush, my hog bristle brush, a filbert from Robert Simmons, and use its quite stiff bristles to just help me get that paint kind of pressed across the surface. After that, I'm going to start painting in some of the colors and values in a kind of value and color mapping section of the painting before I really start to resolve things in earnest. That is going to mean that I want to start from the kind of middle tones and work outward from there, meaning that eventually the darkest color and the lightest color will be some of the final things that I really put into place, saving those for the end, just because. And this is interesting in that it relates so much to drawing, and I want to just refer for a moment back to the drawing processes that I talk about a lot. Every shape or every form is a kind of transition, which is to say we very rarely have just a line on the surface of the paper without any preceding or value kind of coming after that. So much they are just a part of a transition. If we look at an area like the lower lid here, most of this is just transitional value that is transitioning at different speeds. So there are fast turns and there are slow turns, meaning long, soft transitions or slightly tighter transitions. And eventually, I think one of the things you come to discover about illustrating form on a 2D surface is that the moments where you have a hard edge are really so rare. And even when they are, they're often mitigated by some small amount of transitional value on either side. With that in mind, the middle out version of painting in oil ensures that you've actually worked a lot of the transition preceding that crease in the form, like we're going to have above the upper eyelid, for instance. But that's enough of me chatting at the camera and pointing at my canvas. I want to get started on this, and I'm going to talk throughout the process. So it's going to be a lot of commentary coming your way. One thing that, for those of you that have all your stuff set up and you're going to be working along, I think that's great. For those of you that just want to watch, that's cool too. Okay, so like I've said, I've got my hog bristle brush here, and I'm just going to mix out a kind of generalized flesh tone. Now, notice how like impactful and punchy that paint color is when I just add a bit of vermilion and white. So this is really just what is called a tint of vermilion, which is to say, like any of these colors, when you start adding white to them, you are tinting them. And so you get to this nice light kind of pastel-y peach, which however, you know, nice is far from anything that we'd really find within an actual flesh tone. So we need to kind of cool it off just a little bit. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take just a touch of black. I don't even know if it's visible on the edge of my brush, but just enough black to kind of take some of the edge off of it. A little bit of yellow. What I want overall is the kind of warm mixture, and this is something also that maybe is misunderstood a little bit, I think, when you're learning about color and value, is that we understand that these pure tints are not going to exist in a flesh tone, but I think that in general, students will oftentimes over-neutralize. So we'll wind up with colors that, though they are, in a way, like a nice, attractive, kind of neutralized pastel color, they're maybe not potent enough to live in terms of flesh tones. So just be aware that early on, the proportion of cool temperatures that you're adding to your flesh tones is very likely to be, and I just say this based on experience, not about anybody individually, but it's very likely that you're kind of over-neutralizing your colors, which is to say you're adding too much blue or black to your orange. And so here we want to kind of avoid that. I tend to, as a color mixer, this is just strange kind of quirk of me, I tend to underutilize yellow. So I have this thing in the back of my mind where I think, shouldn't I use just a little bit more of that yellow brown? So it winds up eventually, and that has implications in what happens in your painting all the way around, because if I underutilize yellow, once I start making darker mixtures, what's going to happen is the combination of vermilion and black is going to lead me to being a little bit too purple. And so in a way, you know, all of these color values are mixed with each other. They all depend on each other to be accurate. So that idea of color context is really brought to life when you're kind of choosing even your initial flesh tones. I'm just going to go ahead and spread some of that across the canvas. Now, when I'm doing this, and there's a little bit of off-camera action, right? So when I'm going off camera, one of the things I'm doing is actually removing a bit of that paint from my paintbrush, because I don't want a really loaded brush for what I'm going to do. I just want like a little glaze of color. And while I'm doing this, probably there's going to be a little bit of camera shake, because unfortunately, when you're scumbling like this, you really have to kind of press into the surface. So please excuse whatever camera shake you're seeing, as at the moment it is technically unavoidable. So you can see how it's not really affecting so much the drawing underneath. It's just giving me this kind of base layer of color to eventually work into. Probably the effect that it is having is kind of lightening a little bit the values that are darkest, and maybe just taking the edge off of the white of the paper. So it's much like an imprimatura in a way. Oh yeah, for those of you, of course, that don't know what an imprimatura is, I will explain. So the reason that it takes, in this case, an Italian name is because where I studied in Florence, that was just the norm for it. But in Italian, imprimatura simply means first coat. And what we're doing is just establishing a kind of a base layer that is a little bit darker than white, so that it kind of can frame our highlights a little bit better. Oftentimes, when you talk about an imprimatura, though, of course, it will be dried before the painting begins. And so this is a little bit different in that I'm laying down a kind of a base layer of wet paint that I can later kind of work into. Let's go ahead and choose a shadow color for blocking in the shadows in this eye. And I'm just going to start with ivory black, as I normally do, just because I know it's going to be a deeper value. And when you're thinking about hue value chroma, which is to say, I'll kind of abbreviate that and just say HVC. So hue value chroma just refers to what actual color is it, the hue. The value, is it dark or light? And then the chroma, is it an intense color or is it a very neutralized color? When you think about the HVC for like a shadow value, you're going to have something that is really relatively chromatic, just because there's not a lot of white in it. So oftentimes, you know, what white does really when you tint something out is it naturally diminishes the chroma in something. So you can have like a high key color that is chromatic, so it has a lot of white added to it, but it is also very chromatic. That's definitely possible, but just more often than not, your darker colors are going to be more chromatic, simply because there's a greater proportion of these pure pigments or pure chromatic hues inside that mixture. So for shadows in general, you're going to have something that's pretty chromatic, but you do want to manage that, because I think something that can happen when you start out these paints, if you start out the chroma in like an incredibly high register, you can end up in this place where you can't like match that throughout the rest of the painting. And so naturally oil paint, you know, mixes back and forth. So when we're creating a transition from the shadow outward, you have this incredibly chromatic mixture inside the shadow mixing together with this very neutralized color in the light shape. And these two are at odds with each other. So the transition winds up being this weird kind of muddy, strange color, because there's an imbalance in between them. And this goes down to like palette selection too. All of the colors that I choose here, even the brands of colors that I use, are all orchestrated in order to make sure that my palette has a sense of balance and I don't have a lot, like one color overpowering the others. Or for instance, like I mentioned, you know, when I'm actually applying all this to the canvas, I don't want to have these unforeseen circumstances where I have a pigment in the shadows really overpowering the transitions that I'm making. So just so you know, everything that you do from the minute you consider making a painting is going to go into and affect what you're doing while you're making that painting, which that sounds really daunting when I say it out loud. But suffice to say, it's, you know, one of those things that we just have to think about, that every time you paint something, every choice that you take goes into the outcome of that painting. So you can see here, the shadow value that I've chosen is really a light one. So if you look at that in relationship to, say, like what black actually looks like, you can see that this is several values up from there. And that, of course, goes into my middle out theory of oil painting. So I want often to work with nice mid-tone color values so that I don't start out with those extremes, because I feel like I can always get to an extreme. That's not such a difficult thing to do, actually, to get to a very extreme color. You know, it's just a matter of taking that intense chromatic hue and just dropping it into your painting. What I want to do is have, throughout the process, an orchestrated, organized version of the colors that allow me to also interweave that with the process of oil painting, right? If oil painting was only about choosing the right color and value, I'm not saying it would be easy, but it would be less complicated than what it really is, which is to say that you need the right color and the value at every stage of the painting. So if you have, in a way, like a good color value that is not necessarily in the right stage of the painting, I think that that can also hinder your process, right? So if you start out, like I said earlier, if you start out with like all these super intense color values in the first stages, that's going to influence everything you do in all the subsequent stages. And that can be a problem, right? Because just in the same way that if you start out with colors that are too neutralized, later on, when the painting is much more fully realized, you're not going to be able to get that chroma back into those areas that you already painted. So it also creates a problem that way. So it's all tied together, people. That's the message here. So now at the moment I'm using my combers a lot, my long-haired combers. So I'm trying to make soft applications and meetings of color value happen here. And since I don't have the most absorbent canvas to work on, I need a brush that is going to not scrape the paint off the surface quite as much. And really you can think about this just in general, like about, you know, your own practices in terms of like whether the linen that you're using is very absorbent or not very absorbent. So whether it grabs the paint a lot or not. If your canvas is very slick, you're probably going to favor a brush that has a kind of lower tensile strength, weaker bristles. At least, by the way, let's just say here, I believe that is the correct use of tensile strength. Anyway, bristles that are softer will benefit you more in the manipulation of paint on a surface that is more slick. If I was using a hog bristle brush on this, like I did when I first kind of laid in the color, that hog bristle brush really just scrapes the paint off the surface almost. So it's very particular the kind of brush that you want to use in combination with the kind of canvas that you want to use. And fine-tuning those things, that's so much, that's like discovering your process. Like that's learning to be an oil painter, is figuring out, relationships like that. So I think we're coming to an interesting place with this eye. We wouldn't mistake it for being done, but I think we're ready to kind of push on a little bit, try and really kind of bring this out. So I'm actually going to work in the iris, because being that it's this kind of center of focus, we need to like establish, in a way, even though this is not like really a full composition, we do need to establish here, the kind of keystone, in a way, for the picture. Now, when you're painting a portrait, oftentimes the keystone really is the eyes, or it is just the face in general, I guess, depending upon how wide the focus of the picture is. So if you're painting like a full-length portrait, probably the fulcrum or the keystone is the face. If you're painting a portrait that is just a head study, then probably it's the eyes inside that. And well, if you're painting just an eye, then of course it's going to be the iris and pupil. But what that means essentially is that we're going to push up a little bit the level of detail there, so that we don't have to push it up out here in the periphery. And by contrast, those peripheral areas will seem a little bit less attention grabbing, which is a really important thing to be able to control in a composition, to know how detail affects the way that we see things. There are some things that naturally just call our attention in a painting. So one of them is value contrast. So if we have a really intense contrasting value, that's going to draw our attention. If we have a very sharp edge, that's going to draw our attention. And if we have a lot of flickering detail, that is also going to draw our attention. With that in mind, when all three of those things are present, sharp edges, strong contrast, and flickering detail, we have really a focal area in the painting. And that is what we're doing here. We're trying to create a circumstance that really calls attention. Also, contrast can be broken down also into different levels as well. So we have value contrast, you have color contrast. Color contrast is also going to draw attention. So it should not be neglected in terms of its importance as well. So you can notice also dynamic between how close to finished the painting gets versus how much I'm able to talk about what I'm doing. I'm sure all of you out there have actually a very similar experience. It can be a little bit of a challenge to work with both of those parts of the brain simultaneously.